Welcome to Bread of the Word, a space for quiet minds and anchored hearts to dwell on the glory of Christ. Let's ponder the verities of God together and meditate on the mysteries we do not yet understand, looking back to our Redeemer, that we might walk forward in His grace. Hello, and welcome back to the Bread of the Word podcast. My name is Tyler, your resident lo-fi theologian, and we are continuing along in our study in the book of Job, covering verses 12 through 17 of chapter 38. These are the words of God. Hast thou commanded the morning since thy days, and caused the dayspring to know his place, that it might take hold of the ends of the earth, that the wicked might be shaken out of it? It is turned as clay to the seal, and they stand as a garment. And from the wicked their light is withholden, and the high arm shall be broken. Hast thou entered into the springs of the sea, or hast thou walked in the search of the depth? Have the gates of death been opened unto thee, or hast thou seen the doors of the shadow of death? A lot of imagery here, and we are continuing along, working through a number of questions that God has posed to Job. Questions about creation, questions about providence, questions about the distinction between creator and creation. And what we have here is a little bit loaded. I wanted to cover more, but I got to verse 17 and thought this needs a little more time. This needs to be fleshed out a little bit before we can move forward. There's some intense poetry in this section. But starting in verse 12 with, hast thou commanded the morning since thy days? We're continuing what we saw last week, continuing that pattern, because we've moved from the act of creation to the act of providence. It's not so much about God making the world as much as it is about God sustaining the world. That we've moved just from beyond just God creating the world, creating the heavens and the earth, and the angels shouted for joy, to the ways that God is telling the sun where to go, where to shine, where the moon and the sea and all this is continually bound to the authority of God. And so he poses to Job, have you commanded the morning since thy days, and caused the dayspring to know his place, that it might take hold of the ends of the earth, that the wicked might be shaken out of it? Have you commanded the sun and the moon? Have you divided the light and the dark? That is the question he poses to Job. And there's a little bit of a poetic undertone to this beyond just the question. Because if we look at these verses, there is a transition, not just from the pictures, but we're seeing this as these are poetic devices. So we're talking about light and dark. We're talking about darkness. We're talking about light, not just in the sense that God made the sun and he made the moon, but also that there are things in the dark that are also subject to God's sovereignty. And this kind of builds off of what we've been seeing in some of the other poetic sections in the book of Job. When Job curses the day he's born, he talks about darkness. These are ideas that Job himself has made reference to quite often. He talks about darkness, he talks about silence, he talks about these differing concepts. And what I see is that God is using the dayspring, he's using the sun and the light as a representative to get to that he is bringing not just the physical light, but metaphorical light into the fray as being subject to his sovereignty. And so, Job, have you commanded the light, that it might take hold of the ends of the earth, that the wicked might be shaken out of it? He says, it is turned as clay to the seal, and they stand as a garment. And from the wicked their light is withholden, and the high arm shall be broken. And the light and dark dynamic is also seen in other places as a picture of sin, of our depravity. If you go to Isaiah 8, it says, to the law and to the testimony, if they speak not according to this word, is because there is no light in them. That essentially the wicked are in the dark. Wickedness is in the dark. Sin is in the dark. Sin conceals itself. Sin does not like to be exposed, and that is what light does. And yet God is the God of light, but he's also the God of darkness. That both of these things are subject to his rule and reign. So God exposes what he wills to expose, and he withholds what he chooses to withhold. We see in Hebrews that all things are exposed to him. And likewise here, we see that he withholds light from the wicked, and he breaks the mighty arm. As we grapple with Job, these are things that we've seen Job, these are things we've seen his friends comment on, is that God withholds wisdom, that he withholds understanding, that he is silent when he chooses to be. These are all things that we've seen other people say, but now God is saying them. Now God audibly is saying to Job, I withhold light. I form light and I form darkness. There is none that can deliver thee out of mine hand. That's in Isaiah. But with Job, he's taking a lot of these same illustrations that Job, that Eliphaz, that Bildad, and Zophar have been using to try to rationalize their understandings of God. And the Lord is basically taking those illustrations and presenting them with how he actually is. And then he poses the question to Job, hast thou entered into the springs of the sea? Hast thou walked in the search of the depths? And I can't help but think about Romans 11 in light of that phrasing, because Romans 11, verse 33, it says, oh, the depth of the riches, both of the wisdom and knowledge of God. How unsearchable are his judgments, and his ways past finding out. For who hath known the mind of the Lord, or who hath been his counselor? Who hath first given to him, and it shall be recompensed unto him again? For of him, and through him, and to him are all things, to whom be glory forever. Amen. Hast thou entered into the springs of the sea? Have you walked in search of the depths? Have you searched out the Almighty unto perfection? That's in Job 11. Have you searched these things out for yourself? Do you have the wisdom of God? That is what is being posed to Job. Do you have perfect understanding? Do you have perfect knowledge? So much so that you walk into these things as if they are your domain, which is what Satan claims to do at the beginning of the book. If we go back to Job 1, when we are introduced to the character of Satan in Job 1, verse 6, now there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan came also among them. And the Lord said unto Satan, whence comest thou? Where have you come from? And Satan answered the Lord and said, from going to and fro in the earth, and from walking up and down in it. And when God asks questions like this in the narratives of Scripture, we see this in Genesis as well, is we understand that God is all-knowing. We understand that God is omniscient. That's one of his incommunicable attributes, which basically means these are things that exist in God that don't exist in us. That God's relationship to knowledge is not like ours. God knows everything. So when God asks Satan, where have you come from? It's not because God didn't know. It's not because there's something about creation, about the world that God was missing. But the act of asking the question is more for our benefit than ours within the purpose of the narrative. That the question paints a picture for us of the difference between God and Satan. So he asked him 3 questions. He says, where have you come from? Have you considered my servant Job? And then I'm sorry, not three questions, two questions and a statement. He says, he is in your power. And within those 3 points, God demonstrates to us that Satan is not all knowing, he is not omnipresent, and he is not all powerful. That Satan is bound to physical space, which is how he goes from place to place, while as God knows all and is everywhere. He's not bound to any one location, but Satan is. Likewise, there are things that Satan does not know, and there are things that Satan cannot do. And all of this is painted for us in Job 1. And we see this same dynamic a little bit, that he poses the question to Job, have you walked around on the earth and up and down on it? Have you walked the earth as if it is your domain? Which is what Satan claims to do in chapter 1. Which is interesting because the word Satan essentially means accuser. And within the context of Job 38, God is basically addressing Job as though he has been an accuser. That you have accused me of being unjust, of not being good. You have brought into question my goodness, my sovereignty. And so he, in dealing with these questions, he is essentially referring to Job as an accuser. Not that he is the devil, but that he has accused God foolishly. And so it's interesting to me that he seems to hearken back to his conversation with Satan in chapter 1 with the question here, have you walked on the earth? Have you searched out the depths? As if they are your domain, as if these are your places to go. But the earth is the Lord's and everything in it. In verse 17, have the gates of death been opened unto thee? Or hast thou seen the doors of the shadow of death? That's a big concept. And when I started reading commentaries on that, I found 9 different directions that I could get pulled into on that. This is a big illustration, and this harkens to various different poetic passages that we could jump to. But what does God mean? That whatever we do with this, what does God mean? When he says the gates of death, when he says the shadow of death. And one thing that we have seen time and time again in Job is references to Sheol, which is Hebrew for the grave, the place of the dead. It is the where do the dead live, essentially. When the body dies, where do we go? And the answer is Sheol, which is the Old Testament understanding of the place of the grave, of the place of the dead. It is a place of silence. It is a place that is under God's jurisdiction. It's under his authority, where God is present as judge to some extent. But it's different from the New Testament when we see words like Hades, when we see words like Tartarus or hell. Those mean something else, because Sheol was not a place of judgment. It was not a place of torment, of punishment. But Hades and hell and all those words in the New Testament absolutely do refer to that. But Sheol is simply referred to as a general place where the dead reside. It's the abode of the dead. So when we see phrases like the gates of death, that is the context, is that we're looking at something different from eternal conscious torment. And while there's definitely some parallels and some continuity in those concepts, there's also some differences. And we could get really in the weeds on the Hebrew understanding of this and the charts and the diagrams and all that. But essentially, God is asking Job if the gates of death open from the inside. Job has referred to his suffering as a living death in places, and he's made mention that perhaps he would be delivered from his suffering if he died. And so the question of God to Job is, have the gates been opened from the inside? Do you move freely in and out of Sheol? Again, building off that imagery of Satan, of walking to and fro on the earth and moving up and down on it. Have the gates been opened to you? Because I shut the gates. We go back a couple verses in Job 38. When I made the cloud the garment thereof, and thick blackness a swaddling band for it, and break up for it my decreed place, and set bars and doors, and said, Hitherto shalt thou come, but no further. And here shall thy proud ways be stayed. Or verse 8, who shut up the sea with doors when it brake forth, as if it had issued out of the womb? God opens doors and he closes doors. God sets boundaries, he sets limits. And within the context of the gates of death, the imagery does continue, that the place of the dead is shut, that people do not come in and out of there. The God keeps them there. And so it's a rhetorical question. The gates of death have not been opened to Job. He says, or hast thou seen the doors of the shadow of death? And that's a phrase we've seen a couple places in Job, but I think more people recognize it from Psalm 23. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. And that is a phrase that appears in a lot of places. This is one of the Old Testament's preferred ways to communicate. It shows up in a number of places, but what is the shadow of death? Mind you, this is parallelism. So we have two statements in this verse that complement each other. And so we have the gates of death and we have the shadow of death. This idea of being overtaken or overshadowed, being covered by death. And this is very abstract, but we have to grapple with this a little bit to understand what God is saying. Why does God say this? There's a purpose, and ultimately this purpose leads us to the cross. It leads us to the resurrection. It leads us to the coming kingdom of Christ. So how do we get there from the shadow of death? It's a very good question. If we go to the New Testament, when Jesus asks Peter, who do men say that I am? Peter says that some say you're Elijah, some say you're a prophet. And then Jesus asks him a second question, who do you say that I am? And he says, thou art the Christ, the Son of the living God. And Jesus responds, flesh and blood hath not revealed this to you, but my Father has revealed this to you. And on this rock, meaning his confession that Jesus is the Christ. On this rock, on this foundation, I will build my church. And the gates of Hades, the gates of hell, shall not stand against it. And we have that same phrasing of gates. And even if we put Job in Greek and we look at what's called the Septuagint, which is the version of Job that the early church would have read, it's still gates. And it's the same, more or less the same phrasing that we see in the New Testament with this passage about the gates of hell. When we look at Revelation with the city and the gates, it's the same word, different derivatives, but it's more or less the same word picture, that there are gates, but these gates are defensive. While as Christ's kingdom advances, that it makes advances on the city of death, on the gates of hell. Why? Because Christ conquers. Christ came conquering and to conquer. So if we go even to the book of Mark, Mark chapter 3, verse 20, and the multitude cometh together again, so they could not so much as eat bread. And when his friends heard this, they went to lay hold of him, for they said, he is beside himself. And the scribes which came down from Jerusalem said, he hath Beelzebub, and by the prince of the devils casteth he out devils. That is a major accusation against Christ, that he performs miracles by the power of Satan. And he, Jesus, called them unto him and said unto them in parables, how can Satan cast out Satan? And if a kingdom be divided against itself, and that kingdom cannot stand, and if a house be divided against itself, that house cannot stand. And if Satan rise up against himself and be divided, he cannot stand, but hath an end. No man can enter into a strong man's house and spoil his goods, except he will first bind the strong man, and then he will spoil his house. Within the context of what we're looking at with the gates of hell and all this, we have the promise of Christ that he's going to enter the strong man's house and bind him. He's going to plunder his house. And I believe that this is in reference to things that have already happened, things that happened at the cross. That Christ bound Satan and plundered his house, that he plundered Sheol. It says elsewhere in Matthew, that just as Jonah was in the heart of the whale for 3 days and 3 nights, so the Son of Man shall go into the heart of the earth for 3 days and 3 nights. And that's building off that Hebrew understanding of Sheol, which is that it is at the bottom of the earth, that it's under the pillars of the earth. But Jesus has all these little pictures where he hints at this idea that he's going to plunder the house of the dead. And then we get to 1 Peter 3:19, backing up a couple verses for context. For Christ hath once suffered for sins, the just for the unjust, that he might bring us to God, being put to death in the flesh, but quickened by the Spirit, by which also he went and preached unto the spirits in prison, which sometime were disobedient, when once the long suffering of God waited in the days of Noah, while the ark was a preparing, wherein few, that is, 8 souls, were saved by water. The like figure, whereunto even baptism doth also now save us, not the putting away of the filth of the flesh, but the answer of a good conscience towards God, by the resurrection of Jesus Christ, who is gone into heaven, and is on the right hand of God, angels and authorities and powers now being made subject unto him. Where all this is going is that Christ has ultimate authority over life, over death, over the grave. He says in Revelation, I have the keys to death and Hades. And so what Job is being questioned about with the shadow of death is Job has not been there. Job has not gone to the place of the dead. But we do have Christ who tasted death for all men. We have Christ who descended down to the earth, lived a perfect sinless life, died a sinner's death in our place, experienced the penalty for sin that should have been on us, and was resurrected from the dead. And now he has been made the heir of all things. All things are subject to his authority, even death, even hell, even the grave. And when God asks this question, this is where we're going. Is that Job has not walked down these roads, but Jesus Christ would. And from our perspective, he has. Revelation 21, verse 11. Having the glory of God, and her light was like unto a stone most precious, even like a jasper stone, clear as crystal, and had a wall great and high, and had 12 gates, and at the gates 12 angels, and names written there, which were the names of the 12 tribes of the children of Israel. On the east 3 gates, on the north 3 gates, on the south 3 gates, and on the west 3 gates. And the wall of the city had 12 foundations, and in them the names of the 12 apostles of the Lamb. There's a lot of emphasis on gates. And it's done in a way that it pictures the completeness of God's people. 12 tribes, 12 apostles. 12 is a number that God uses a lot, and it seems to correspond with the completeness of his people. That he's purchased out of every tribe, tongue, and nation a people for his own possession. And going down to verse 25, and the gates of it shall not be shut at all by day, for there shall be no night there. And they shall bring the glory and honor of the nations into it, and there shall in no wise enter into it anything that defileth, neither whatsoever worketh abomination or maketh a lie, but they which are written in the Lamb's book of life. What was once a picture of silence, of judgment, of isolation, has become something new. That now we do not have the gates of death. Now we have the gates of the city of our God, where God will dwell with his people. And there will be no unclean thing. There will be no lying. There will be no wickedness. There will be no sin. And those gates are open. Job gives us picture after picture of closed gates, darkness, and silence. But the New Jerusalem, the city of our God, the place to which the church is going, is marked by open gates, by light, by worship, and the presence of Christ. So while we may have moments where we relate to Job in that we are in a place of silence, where God seems silent and we're just trying to figure this out, where we read Psalm 88, I am alone and my companions have become darkness, and we feel seen. There may be times like that. But this is where we're going. If we have Christ, if Christ has us, we're going to a city with open gates, a city illuminated by the glory of God. We're going to a holy city. And that city will be here on this earth, made new. And so the laments of Job will be a distant memory, because God will make his dwelling place with man. He will tabernacle with us. And to ponder those things this week, what does that cause me to do now? How does that drive me to live today? If there is a city that is coming down with open gates and light and worship and fellowship with our God, it means that the silence I may perceive is temporary. It means that God may seem silent for a season, but there will be a day when that is a distant memory, where the perceived silence of God is just a thing of the past, because we will worship God in an environment where sin doesn't exist, in an environment devoid of wickedness, of agony, of grief. We will worship God in his natural environment, and the sins which now entrap us, the sins by which we are condemned apart from the righteousness of Christ, will not hold us back from worshiping Christ and dwelling with him. This is something that Job looked ahead to. I know that my Redeemer liveth, and that he shall stand upon the earth. And this is what we look ahead to, that our Redeemer is a living Redeemer, that he shall stand on the earth, that he shall make the earth new. He shall make us new, and we will dwell with him in that newness for eternity. And so in light of these things, to God be glory interminable, and to his Son Christ, being God and man, and to the Holy Ghost inseparable, as it has been since the world began. Thank you for joining me today on the Bread of the Word podcast. I pray that the words we've shared have nourished your soul and helped you grow in your faith. If you found this episode helpful, consider sharing it with a friend and subscribe for more conversations on the Word of God and the journey of faith. Until next time, I am Tyler, your Lo-Fi Theologian.